In this lecture, we will focus on the structure of the arguments that are provided in support of solving moral dilemmas one way or the other. We saw that when applying ethical frameworks to make a moral decision, one has to provide reasons that link that ethical framework with the action that is prescribed as being morally good or morally permissible. So in this lecture, I'll walk you through general definition of an argument, and then we will look at the structure of two broad types of arguments, deductive argument and inductive argument. So we'll be talking about how to evaluate these types of arguments and what it counts as deductive validity and inductive strength. Argument. When we construct an argument, we put forward a claim and one or more reasons for believing the claim. The claim we put forward is called a conclusion. The reasons for believing that claim are called the premises. Let's take an example. We have a duty not to exploit non-human animals, but when we engineer their genes, this isn't what we are doing. Therefore, we shouldn't genetically engineer non-human animals. We can extract a logic book style form of this argument and identify the premises and the conclusion. Premise 1 of this argument is that we have a duty not to exploit non-human animals. Premise 2 of the argument is that we exploit non-human animals when we engineer their genes. And the conclusion, we shouldn't genetically engineer non-human animals. So, in an argument, a position is taken, the conclusion, together with at least one reason, possibly more, for holding that position. These are the premises. There are two different types of argument. There are different types of argument, but all fall into one of the two categories: deductive arguments and inductive arguments. Now, if an argument is presented in its logic book style, then it is not only easy to identify, but also to evaluate. We can say whether it's a good or a bad argument. However, most arguments that we encountered in speaking and writing across different contexts, and not only in bioethical debates, do not look or sound like a logic book style argument. That is why some preliminary steps are required to identify the arguments before we get into the business of actually evaluating whether they are good or bad arguments. What are these preliminary steps? First, we have to identify the conclusion of the argument. Then we identify each of the premises, add any suppressed premises. Then we should remove irrelevancies. So arguing is not the only thing we are doing when communicating with each other. We can express our frustration or reflect on a possible solution to a difficult situation. In setting out the argument logic book style, we need to disentangle the argument from the other things we do in the conversation. This helps reveal the structure of the argument. We can see more clearly the statement being made and the reasons offered in support of it. And finally, we should be careful to remove inconsistent terms. In setting out an argument, logic book style, it's alright to paraphrase the premises and the conclusion so that the relationship between them becomes more obvious. But we should be careful not to change the meaning of the words of the argument. Let's now look a bit more closely to the structure of deductive arguments. Deductive arguments are either valid or invalid. The conclusions of deductively valid arguments are certain. Let's take an example. Premise: if a patient is in a permanent vegetative state, then he will not be conscious. Premise 2, the patient is in permanent vegetative state. Therefore, the patient will not be conscious. This argument is deductively valid. If the premise of this argument are true, then the conclusion must be true as well. We say that the conclusion follows from the premises. Compare this with the following example. If the patient is in a permanent vegetative state, then the patient is unconscious. The patient is unconscious, therefore the patient is in a permanent vegetative state. Argument 3 is deductively invalid. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. or the truth of the premises doesn't guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Compare the structure of deductive arguments, thus laid out, with that of inductive arguments. Now, induction is central to the scientific method, and it rests on an extrapolation from something observed to something unobserved. And such an extrapolation assumes that future observations will be like past observation. Inductive arguments, even at their strongest, do not deliver perfectly strong guarantees because all such arguments rely on the principle of the uniformity of nature, as David Hume called it. So philosopher David Hume noted that every time we try to justify our use of the principle of the uniformity of nature, our reasoning goes in a circle. We might claim that the future will be like the past because the future always has been like the past. But immediately the circle appears. Just because the future has been like the past in the past doesn't mean we can assume that the future will be like the past in the future. Because inductive arguments rely on this principle, they cannot deliver certain conclusions. Inductive arguments can be only strong or weak, and inductive strength is just a matter of degree. Consider the following example. People with Huntington's disease have always been observed to have the HD gene on chromosome 4. Conclusion: the next person to develop Huntington's disease will be observed to have the HD gene on chromosome 4. Argument 4 is inductively strong argument. If the premise of this argument is true, then the conclusion is very likely to be true as well. But compare it to another inductive argument. Premise: when I passed the exam, I wore my red shirt. And conclusion: if I wear a red shirt to my next exam, then I will pass that exam too. This argument is inductively weak. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. Even if the premise is true, the likelihood of the conclusion is hardly raised at all. Keep in mind, though, that the fact that conclusions of deductively valid arguments are certain and those of inductively strong arguments only almost certain does not make induction inferior to deduction. Both deduction and induction are important to science, but science or scientific method wouldn't be possible without induction. These are the basics of covering the structure of deductive and inductive arguments. But we haven't said anything yet about how to evaluate them. It is important to know how to evaluate both deductive and inductive arguments because bad arguments can lead us astray. In evaluating an argument, we must evaluate each of the sentences that constitute the argument as being either true or false. But we must also evaluate the argument as a whole, namely the claim that the conclusion follows from the premises. If the conclusion follows from the premises, the argument is good. If the premises are also true, then the argument is said to be sound. If the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, the argument is bad, irrespective of the truth of the premises. Keep in mind, the argument itself is neither true nor false, just like tables are neither brave or not brave. In summary, every time we evaluate an argument, we must ask two types of questions. Question number 1, are the premises all true? Question number 2, does the conclusion follow from the premises? The relation of following from covers two sorts of relation between premises and conclusion. 1. The conclusion of a deductive argument follows from its premises if the argument is deductively valid, and the conclusion of an inductive argument follows from its premises if the argument is inductively strong. So, when an argument is deductively valid or inductively strong, then its conclusion follows from its premises. Next, we would look at how we evaluate deductive validity and inductive strength. So we would look at the strategies applied to evaluate the correctness of inductive and deductive arguments.